Well, I want to say welcome to everybody. Normally, because this is Church Financial Foundation, we pray. So I want to bow my heart to the Lord and say, Father, in Jesus' name, I submit this to you, this time, these people, and Father, this information. I pray that we have ears to hear and eyes to see and a heart to understand that this is part of the body of Christ, the work that you have for us on the earth. And I thank you for that. And I thank you for being with us today in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, those that know me, and I think you all do, I've been a bookkeeper for over 40 years. And when I realized about 10 years ago that people in the body of Christ do not have the knowledge and understanding that I have about how things work in the financial areas like payroll or bookkeeping. And I always thought, well, yeah, they know that. And there was a gal who worked at a bank that called me and she said they put me in charge of the finances and I don't have a clue what I'm doing. So I just did a simple spreadsheet for her. And she said, you've got to do classes. Okay, so I've been doing classes pretty much since then. And when I do 3 or 4 of the basic bookkeeping class, I like to pop into a payroll because there's not a lot of difference in payroll, but there are some specifics when you have a pastor who is a dual status. That means he is on payroll for his salary, but his housing and his self-employment, all that goes under a different form in his taxes. So there are some books right up front I'm going to share with you. The most important is Publication 517 and then a 15A, which is the second one. If you go online to the irs.gov and put these in, there's like 30, there's 28 pages on one, there's 30 some pages on the other. Take a highlighter, read it, what you know is pertinent to your church or to your job or to your ministry, highlight that. Keep the book for a reference. They change it every year, but it doesn't really change. There might be a few things. I was sharing with Ken before you got here that there is actually a new 1099 NEC coming in for next year. So some churches actually only give their pastor a 1099. They're small, they don't have a big staff, they don't pay a big staff. So a pastor or sometimes an associate pastor or a youth pastor, they just 1099 them. I'm not going to say there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to say there's nothing right with that. I'm just going to say they do it. There are specifics the IRS says, and they say you have to put your pastor on payroll. You have to give him a W-2, they say. Nobody does it, unless they have a big payroll situation. And at this point, with the changes in the tax laws, the changes in, well, they've been screaming, get rid of the housing. Does everybody know what a housing allowance is? Okay, a portion of your pastor's salary can be designated housing allowance, and we'll talk about that. That housing allowance is not taxable to him, but it is taxable under his self-employment. So he doesn't have to pay income tax on it, but they have to. That's why the dual status. It splits his income. And the housing allowance is an expense for the church, goes through the normal bookkeeping. But the pastor himself, and he has to handle a certain amount of duties to be able to have that housing allowance. So, the one difference, pretty much one difference in churches versus business in payroll is the pastor's housing allowance. Not everybody that works for the church can get that housing allowance. Only the main pastor or an associate pastor. And it is very true that it has to be stipulated in your minutes or through some kind of letter to the pastor, because it has to be documented so he can use it, because it shelters some of his income. So, There was, okay, there is one thing you can also do. There are situations where a pastor does not have to pay Social Security. Now, we're not going there yet. Because they can, what they call, opt out of Social Security. Again, some pastors don't understand. If they file this form with the IRS and they get this opt out, they have to be able to document that. And I've heard years ago, I haven't heard it recently, but that the IRS doesn't keep that form. So how are you gonna prove it if you don't keep your form? So, again, there's these little nuances that happen that people get part of the information and then they don't follow through with it. One thing on this opting out, exemption for self-employment tax for use by ministers. It says file original and 2 copies and attach supporting documents. This exemption is granted only if the IRS returns a copy to you marked approved. And a couple of years ago, we found out that they would go ahead and send it back. You'd send it in, they'd send it back to you, but you had to sign it and send it back in. Well, they would send it in and say it was done. So I knew a number of, as in at least 4, if not more, young pastors started a church plants. They started a church and they did their paperwork, they sent their form in. Well, did you get it back? Did you put it on file? Did you put it in your safe? No. So, at some point, we live in a fallen world. At some point, the IRS is gonna start hitting churches. They can't audit them now. They can't go into your church and say, I want this, that, or the other. They can't do it unless someone in your congregation decides, well, I'm gonna say I gave $10,000 and take it off my tax. That didn't work. Again, that's why I say I'd like you to do the first part of this seminar because it gives you some foundation on the bookkeeping. Because as of 2007, the IRS said, oh, you can give anything $250 or more, but you have to have a letter or a statement from the church saying you gave that. It has to back your check. The reason I use that example is because if your payroll is messed up and they come in and audit your payroll, they can come in the back door and audit the church. So you want clean books. And God keeps good books, so let's do it too. So, before I get ahead of myself, let's just stay with the PowerPoint. So there are specifics. Like I said, this is very similar to having payroll in a business, other than a few little tweaks. So you want your employee forms in your personnel file, which is a confidential file, which has to be kept separate from your other files, by the way. According to the law, you can't have all your vendor files with all your employees stuck in there. You have to keep them separate. You have to keep them locked up. They have to be confidential. In that, you keep your W-4 and your I-9. Your I-9, your W-4 is your tax thing where they say how many exemptions they want on their payroll. Their I-9 is the Homeland Security that says, yes, I have the right to work in the United States. A new hire report. I don't know how many years ago, because this happened also in Oregon when I worked there, but probably within the last 15 or 20 years, anybody gets hired, including in a church, you have to put a new hire report and you have to send it to the state. That's how they find these people, and it's really big in construction. That's how they find these guys that don't pay child support. Because within 20 days, you're supposed to file that. And to prove that, you can either send them, fax them, email them a copy of the W-4 and make a note that you also use that as your new hire, or do this separate report for new hire. Notice of the health care exchange, Obamacare. A couple years ago, we ended up with Obamacare and that Affordable Health Care Act. It affects churches also. And a lot of churches don't understand, they're still part of that. So, to go back to, once you've got, and that includes your pastor, have all those forms lined up with a pastor file. But with a pastor, you want the additional form, which is one of these, where they have received either the exemption from self-employment, which is a 4361, or they've done the exemption from Social Security and Medicare taxes and waiver of benefits. Again, I really encourage everyone that does some kind of payroll in their church, if you're on a board, if you have anything to do with wanting to know your responsibility, get a copy of Publication 517 from the IRS and read it. Some of this stuff sounds confusing, but if you just keep going slow, you'll see that a lot of it is just a repetition of a lot of information. So that's why you have me. So those two forms, either one. So we go back to we talked about the dual status. He's a self-employed person for some things, and he's a salaried person for some things. Again, that's part of the reason smaller churches, they just do the 1099, put everything together. The Form 4361 actually will opt them out of any kind of Social Security, which means when they're 22 and they're young and they don't have a responsibility of a family, they don't understand retirement. I mean, we don't have to worry about that for 40-some years. So they opt out thinking, I'm gonna save taxes. If someone opts out in your staff of ministers, make sure that the church is somehow providing some kind of future pension information for them. And the reason being is, they've only had 2 times you could opt back in, and they didn't tell anybody. I think 1952 and 2006, those dates might be incorrect, but they didn't bother to tell anybody. And I had a pastor 3 years ago, because I was living here, and I was talking to him about getting his books established and brought in order and stuff. He said, oh, well, I can opt in anytime. And I said, no, you can't. He said, what do you mean? I said, you can't just go back and opt back into Social Security. Social Security works in a quarter situation. Like, you have to have 23 quarters of income through a past amount and a certain, to even be able to apply for Social Security. Well, if you've opted out for the last 20, 30 years, you have no Social Security. You can't go, okay, I have a pastor friend that has 6 children. He opted out. So what are you gonna do if something happens to you? Because there's survivor benefits. Your kids are covered. You know, so don't be real quick, especially if you have a young pastor. Find out what he knows about this stuff, and don't be quick to opt out and save money, because you don't know what the future. Is God gonna take care of us? Absolutely. Is he required to take care of us? No. He gives us the opportunity to use wisdom and knowledge and understanding. Emily?
What did you mean when you said the church should do
The church has some kind of pension. I have a pastor that he pays his Social Security, but the church also does, his is a 403B pension plan. The church pays the pension, the church pays his medical, but he's part of a denomination. So they have all this set up through their headquarters. Smaller churches, find out, protect your pastors. Find out what is going on in their financial, as far as maybe they don't have or can't afford to have. Let's face it, a pastor with 3 or 4 kids who's on pastor's salary, even with the housing allowance, it's not taxable. You don't know where they're at. Make sure if the church can in any way even start a small pension fund for them to take care of in their future. It's the kind of thing that the board or the staff, you don't think about this, but this is God's work. These are his people, and they're giving up their their life, basically, if it's a true calling from the Lord, to do God's work. So God has to come first. So use some wisdom in your board, in your treasurer, in your different areas of ministry. Use some wisdom to make sure you're protecting your people. How did I get there? Back up. I must have hit it. Yep, I sure did hit it. Okay. How about going the right way, too? Okay. Let's put that there. So the status of the minister, a minister has a special status which helps him in his taxes. If he's done the 4361 to opt out, find out if he's got some kind of backup for retirement. If they haven't opted out, then the church is paying their, or half of their Social Security if they're on salary, if they have payroll. If they're just given so much money, I had one young man, he was on salary, he had not opted out, but when he was hired, he asked the church to pay his self-employment, SICA, his self-employment taxes by writing the check directly to the IRS. So he would tell them how much they were every quarter. His estimated taxes were paid by the church directly to the IRS, so he didn't touch the money. So they didn't put that as part of his salary. But they paid his self-employment taxes as a benefit to him. And he actually had it written into his contract. So what is a housing allowance? It is it is simply funds that are documented by the church, usually in the minutes, saying we're going to give so much. This is a form at the end of your book. A pastor can take this and fill it out, and what it does, it calculates an estimation of what it would cost him in 1 year to maintain his house. And I believe when you read up on all the information, he can claim everything with the exception of lawn care and maid service. So if it costs you, as a pastor, if it's costing you, say, $40,000, what's that, 10,000? No. That's 5,000, $60,000 a year, $5,000 a month for your house payment, your utilities, your groceries, your whatevers and whatevers and whatevers. If the board, they submit this to the board and the board agrees, then out of his $100,000 salary, $60,000 of that gets separated as housing allowance. $40,000 is his taxable income. So how does he get it? There is, I don't have my notes, I haven't done this in 3 or 4 years, but there's 5 things a minister has to do to be available, able to do the housing allowance. One is they have to lead worship, they have to do Marian and Bury-in, they have to be on call like 24 hours. I mean, there's some specifics. The senior pastor, if he meets all those, and again, in the church now, we have denominations, we have independents, we have so many different variances of how the boards work, and how the structure of the denomination. United Pentecostals, the pastor gets all the money, and then he is responsible. The Presbyterians, the board runs everything, and he's just a salaried employee, the pastor is. Some churches, the pastor is the head guy. He does it all. Other churches, the board stipulates what, where, how, and why. And the pastor brings the word. So Catholics, you've got your priests that, everything goes to the church and they get their stipends back. So you've got churches, you've got nonprofit ministries. So there's some specifics for pastors on how to get this housing allowance. And again, this Social Security is good, and the 1517 and the 15-A, all that has tremendous amount of information on how to take care of and make sure your pastor and your church is doing things right. protecting your pastor, helping them. And this form on the back, it's an old form, but it simply says, if they do something like this once a year, they can monitor how much. Now suppose, I know a guy, he was in the ministry, his house was paid off, totally clear, and he was still saying, oh, I still want this $40,000 a year housing allowance. The board came in and said, well, no, we're not gonna put our church in jeopardy simply because you want so much more, covered under your sheltered from your taxes through this housing allowance. So that's the first time I've heard of a board that stepped in and said, wait a minute, we're gonna keep integrity in this ministry. But most of the time, the board gets the information from the pastor, and that's how much of their salary is set aside as housing. When the pastor's taxes are done, that's where he has to justify. Because it's very similar, I believe, to the reimbursement. If you give your pastor the $200 a month for a year and he can't come up with $2,400 worth of expenses, what's left over is taxable income to him. And what we're doing through being part of a church and learning this information is protecting the pastor, protect the church. So, hey, so the handout on the back is just to give you that kind of information and to trigger things that actually are allowed under that housing allowance. There was a pastor that said, well, they said I could only do like $800 a month. No, you can do everything. If you add up everything on that list and it's costing you $2,000 a month, then $2,000 can be your housing allowance. But it has to come through the board, and it has to come prior to, no, I will rephrase that. It's supposed to come prior to the new year. Well, a lot of ministries have their annual main board meeting like in February. So in February, they say, yeah, the pastor's housing allowance will be X amount of dollars. They don't have them in December, they have them in February. I mean, I can't tell them how to do it. Just make sure it's in the minutes, this was the approved amount, because it protects the church when the payroll's done. Yeah, Chad?
So we have kind of a dinosaur issue. We actually have a parsonage.
Mm-hmm.
And so over the years, I've done different ways of reporting that on the W-2. I think I'm still correct, be putting it in box 14 or whatever, the free market value or whatever. Is that the correct thing to do? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because what he needs to have it documented how much he's getting because of the self-employment tax. But for income tax, yeah, that's why it's not part of his wage. That's why when Ken was saying, when he did the 1099, you include it in the total amount on the 1099, but you make a note to the pastor that actually this amount is your housing. Because when he gets his taxes done, all that's got to be cleared out. So, to go back to payroll, you have to have a federal employee ID number to do payroll. So you get that through the SS4, you can do it online now. But then you have to set up for pay and payroll taxes. They have to be paid by the EFTPS. That's the Electronic Fund Transfer Payment System for the government. And it used to be you paid them at the bank or you mailed them in. Now you actually electronically go online. And if you have QuickBooks for your payroll, your QuickBooks will actually tell you the date it has to be paid. I mean, there's a lot of good things about QuickBooks. Other than constantly telling you how they can do it better than you, they're pretty good. So quarterly federal tax reports. When you apply for your EIN, at the same time they ask, are you going to have employees? Well, if you don't have employees yet, they're automatically going to set you up for the 941. If you get a quarterly federal tax report 941, that just says we pulled this much withholding tax for our staff, And here it is, you send it in, this is the report, you do it every quarter. If you don't have payroll, you have to send that form in with zeros on it. You are fined if you don't send it in. So if you're gonna be establishing payroll and it's gonna take you 6 months, be aware when those forms show up, they've gotta be taken care of every quarter. And they're due the end of the month prior to the end of the quarter. Federal unemployment tax. Churches do not pay unemployment. They don't pay state unemployment, they don't pay federal unemployment. So churches, small ministries, nonprofits will, but churches do not pay unemployment. So if you have someone on your staff that's once gonna be your janitor and they're gonna come and you're gonna pay them through your payroll and they quit, or you let them go, whatever the unemployment processes are, they can't get in and file for unemployment because the church doesn't pay for it. In a business, of course, the business pays, but not in churches. So you don't have your federal, you don't have your state unemployment. The state of Idaho, you have to get a tax account. Because as long as on payroll, if you're pulling, and it's very similar, if you're pulling withholding state and federal taxes, you gotta send them in. State of Idaho, it's called TAP, T-A-P, and you go online and but it's the same thing. When you pay it, they got a new system now in Idaho. When you do your form and you say you're gonna pay $215 for withholding, that automatically files your report. If you had no and you say 0, that automatically files your report for your tax withholding, which is a good system, because now you don't have to do 2 things. You don't have to send the money in and then do a report. Colorado, you gotta do 3 different reports. Department of Labor, again, that's the unemployment in the state of Idaho. No, you don't have that.
What if we are paying that?
You double check and find out why. Yeah, find out why it was set up as a church. Because there might be some specific reason why they set it up. Maybe they wanted to pay unemployment. That makes sense, but I would look into that, yeah. Dig into that one. Okay. Workers' compensation. Although you don't do unemployment insurance, it is pretty smart to do workers' compensation, because that covers your volunteers, it covers your any staff, anybody that works at trips like I did the other night. You know, although it didn't affect me when I tripped and fell, if something had happened, that company where I was at, the workers' comp would have come in and covered, or the general liability would have come in. If I was an employee, it would be workers' comp. So even though you don't have unemployment insurance, you should, I think in the state of Idaho, you must get, at least for the pastor, the workers' comp. But one thing that I found out is when you do the workers' compensation insurance reports that they require, you have to add in the housing compensation to that. So it's not, even though you don't, it's disconnected for taxes, it's reconnected for workers' comp insurance. And again, that just protects your pastor and your people if they're working. It's pretty, some churches just don't want to pay it for volunteers because it's expensive. But how much physical activity are your volunteers going to do in your working in your church? That's where you have to calculate. Do we pay it for volunteers too, or do we just cover our documented staff? But again, you do have to include the housing allowance on that. So, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Does a church have to comply? Yes, they do. And there is 2 things. You can go online to the Health Insurance Marketplace, and there's one, employers who offer coverage to their employees. You can get this options in your health coverage information, Employers who do not offer, it looks almost exactly the same, but it's not, it does have another page. And this one, again, the insurance, the market, all this stuff has changed in the last couple of years, but you have to offer it, this particular thing, to your employees. So that tells them you do not offer it and they have to get it. And then you have them sign a letter saying, yeah, it was offered to me, I understand. And then you file that in that confidential file for them, because it's similar to the I-9. The I-9 says, yes, I have the right to work in the United States, and here's all my information, but that doesn't go anywhere except into their file. But Homeland Security does check up. I haven't heard they've ever checked up on a church, but in businesses, they'll go in and check their files and see. And because the church is supposed to have those things on file, including a letter saying, yes, we offer it and everybody's on our medical, or no, we don't offer it, but they are aware of it and they're doing the marketplace now, it protects the church. And that's the bottom line for boards and for staff. You want to protect your pastor and the church and the structure.
How many hours would somebody have to work to qualify? Like, is that for every employee, they have to be given that option?
It depends on what you've got set up, but yeah, every employee should be given the option. How many employees do you have at your Rev 22?
8,
You have 8?
but half are full-time and half are part-time.
Okay, well, whatever is established. What has been established through your board for medical?
Full-time employee only.
Only. See, even though the unemployment department doesn't have anything to do, Department of Labor doesn't have anything to do for churches. If there's ever a labor dispute, a labor board will always go back to your established manual. So if you don't have one, get one. These things that the board establishes, get them written up. Get them written up so people know that, because that's what they'll do. Department of Labor will always go back to what is established in your business, in your church. Well, full-time. You have 2 full-time and 6 part-time. 6 part-time are not eligible according to your structure that is in writing for your church. So, but that was, when this first came out, when Obamacare first, everybody was scattering to try to find out what in the world are they saying and what do we have to do. And I guess it's still around. Anyway, there are federal acts that apply to religious organizations, churches, workers' compensation insurance, Obamacare, the Family Medical Leave Act, Civil Rights Act of the Equal Employment Opportunities, American Disabilities Act, all of these, age discrimination, all of these, and I have State of Idaho posters. These have to be somewhere in your office where people can see them. These have to be posted. Here's your federal minimum wage. And when I had, these come free, you can print them right off the internet under the State of Idaho. I just put them in a book. I did them for one small ministry. And all I did is I got their list, I printed out everything, and I stapled them together, put them on a paper clip with a push pin on the side of his office. He said, what is that? I said, that's all your posters for the state.
Where do we find those at?
I just, State of Idaho. I just Googled it. What does the State of Idaho have to post for an employee? Military leave, rights under USERRA, so there's all of these. Does the church have to post them? Yeah. Now you could spend $80 and get the great big poster that they'll send in that's laminate with all these little posters on it. You could save $80 and go online and do it like this.
When you say posted, can we post a notebook like that in like the workroom?
Oh yeah.
So if I have that
Anyway.
exact binder, or if we have it in our business office,
Yeah.
is that considered posted?
on your premise.
Is that, okay, perfect,
As far as I know, it is.
okay, good,
Yeah.
that's perfect.
Yeah, and I checked with the federal, and the only thing, difference with the federal was, as far as their posters that had to be posted, was, they want to know, it didn't have to be posted, but if the IRS is not notified that the responsible party changed using Form 8822B, they can fine you for that too. And what that is, when your church was set up, if it has a board, somebody on that board was established as the agent. So all correspondence goes to that agent. Well, maybe it was 10 years ago and that person has passed away, they moved to a different church, whatever. Find out who the agent is. And if it's not who the current person is, you pull that form up online and go ahead and just fill it out. All that says is, this is who it is.
If that change happened a number of years ago and we're just filing it, is that any kind of?
Just
flag?
file with the current person.
Okay. no.
They don't know.
Okay.
We're not gonna tell them.
Is that different than the state of Idaho annual?
Annual
Like
report.
file
It is
something
different.
annual?
This
Okay.
is with the IRS. Now, the state of Idaho does want an annual report filed. Again, it's online now. And every church should get it because you're registered with the state as a church or a corporation. And all that does is say, yeah, these are the people in charge. This is still the agent. Doesn't cost anything, you just gotta go do it. So, and this is very similar with the IRS, because the IRS found out that. They would go to contact somebody and nobody would respond and nobody answered all their correspondence and found out, well, that guy passed away 5 years ago. That address is no longer, so they're saying, nope, we wanna know. We wanna know where you are and who you are. So the poster compliance, interesting thing. They doubled the fines for people who hadn't got their posters posted. It used to be $100, now it's 210, but it's per poster. They don't tell you that. It's per, you don't have that one and that one and that one, but you've got that one and that one. Now you've got 3, that's $630. It's like, no, that's okay. We'll make a binder, we'll put it in the office, don't stick it in the back of a bookcase, but keep it out where someone can see it. Make sure all of your employees are aware it's there. So you have a staff meeting, say, oh, by the way, we updated all our posters, people need to know. Keep it simple, but let them know you're in compliance, and there they are. Again, 2014. So what happens with the IRS, and that's why it's good to get this, at least read this, what's new on the front of the 517, and each publication they do, they put a what's new. You don't have to reprint them every year, but read that what's new. See if anything connects to you. And where your responsibility, your responsibility portion, many times, you go and you do payroll and you're part of doing payroll, well, check at the end of the year, did anything change for next year? Just for your own personal information. You may not, like Emily said, they use a service. Well, you can check up on the service by making sure that you know what they're supposed to know. You don't have to do it, but to know what they know. So, and the poster compliance, no one's ever talked about that. No one's told you how many people have it in their church office, posters. You go,
Well, we have one, but I need to look at it. I
yeah,
don't know
double
if
check it,
it's
just
state.
make sure it's current, because that's what you want. You have them here at the bank, Molly?
Yes,
Yeah, see?
yeah, back in the kitchen.
So businesses are more likely to stay on this, but churches have to comply too. The business portion of it. So, record keeping. People have asked me, how long do I keep the W-2s on file? How long do I keep my bank statements? How long do I keep this or that? There's certain things, you have a vendor file where you buy stuff and you keep this file. you only have to keep those 2 or 3 years. You don't have to keep all this paperwork. And actually, a lot of people now are scanning them in and keeping them electronically for this year or whatever. But keep your records at least 10 years after the end of your reporting month. Well, that doesn't make sense because churches don't do tax returns. So when a tax return would have been due, so if you had to do a tax return for 2019, it would be due by April 15th. So 4 years after April 15th of 2020, then you can purge a lot of your files. I have always said keep bank statements, payroll reports, prior year W-2s, a minimum of 10 years. And what is not known, and I'll just throw this out because it's not common knowledge, your church has a general liability policy. And that protects the church. That's the church's insurance policy. Never get rid of those. Why? In a business, someone gets hurt. And they say, oh yeah, you know, I fell, I hurt my back, we went to the doctor, they gave me meds, it worked out, okay. 20 years down the line, they come back and they say, you know, that injury 20 years ago was flared back up and I have an issue. And they can go back to that company. The insurance company that they had the policy with 20 years ago is liable for that injury, not the insurance company you have today. So if you never get rid of your general liability or liability insurance policies, that will be too soon. Keep them. It may not ever happen, but it may. And if it does, you want, again, protect the church. Have this kind of understanding. So, yeah, that's just a tidbit. And I think, yeah. You'll notice the last frame on your book has these publications where you can go in and you can do your research. So, like I said, there's not a lot of difference in payroll with a church other than that pastors, and because it's got the housing allowance, I've had pastors ask me, who do you have do your who should I have do my taxes? Find somebody that knows churches or nonprofits, because they have these little tweaks. Because you take the H&R Block, they don't know, they could put your housing under your regular, you gotta pay more taxes, you don't want that. Again, protect your people by having some knowledge. And there's not a lot, but there it is.